Instead of the usual shilling like, comment, subscribe, rate, let's begin. Monsters have been a fascinating subject in human history. Since time immemorial, we had stories about creatures in the dark waiting to feed upon humans. Stories told around the fire about what is at the tribe's edge at night. These stories and creatures have captivated the human mind so much that many great things were attributed to them. So much did humanity like monster stories that there are multiple interpretations about the looks and origins of certain monsters. Take for example Medusa. She was one of the three Gorgons, the only one that could die, daughters of Phorcys and Keto. All three sisters were in the beginning made to look monstrous, but later on in history they were made to look like beautiful women. Then we have Ovid's interpretation and metamorphosis of Medusa being a cursed woman after a certain forceful event took place in the temple of Athena thanks to Poseidon. For the sake of this long example, I'll also bring up the feminist interpretation of this transformation of Medusa not being a curse, but in fact, it was a blessing. But that's a Marxist interpretation, and all Marxist interpretations are purely wrong. Nevertheless, monsters continue to be part of human culture. As human civilization evolved, so too did our stories. Monsters turned from giant flying lizards or wolves to creatures that have the visage of a man, but represent only a mockery of mankind. Monsters now no longer represented what was hidden in the dark, malevolently waiting to hurt humanity. No, they were now complex creatures that made you ponder life, such as Frankenstein, or showed you the horror that humanity can become, such as Dracula. But humanity didn't discard old monsters and make new ones. Some got a new look to them. Werewolves. Maybe as old as the Epic of Gilgamesh, where Gilgamesh refuses a woman that turned her husband into a wolf. But surely as old as the legend of Lycaon, where Lycaon serves Zeus human flesh, and in disgust, Zeus turned him and his sons into wolves. And that's just one interpretation of the story. Wolves in the 19th century represented the beast within, a fight against the modern world. The evolution of monsters is one that happened throughout centuries, going from evil monsters to more complex, but most of the times, still evil monsters. And now, these monsters that were created to show something evil about humanity have taken a more humanized approach. Monsters are a narrative tool with which to input human struggles onto fantastical beings. Of course, monsters did not replace humans, because now we don't only have the human struggle, but they also have their own monstrous struggle. Look at Twilight, for example. The Cullens have to deal with normal human struggles, making relationships, friends, getting jobs, etc. But they also have to deal with their cravings for blood. This makes the vampires both relatable and foreign at the same time. We also have to consider that the two types of monsters, the ancient ones and, for lack of a better word, the Victorian ones, like Frankenstein, Dracula, etc., still have a place in society today. Americans have an obsession with the Wendigo, and that, I think, is proof enough that ancient evil monsters are still an interesting concept. And any media that has a Dracula-like vampire is proof that what Bram Stoker gave us still holds up in modern times. But that wouldn't be the only change monsters would go through. Fantasy as a genre would boom in the 20th century. New stories and monsters would appear. What a time to be alive and experience the birth of a genre. Those new monsters ranged from ancient, purely evil beings We can give some examples from H.P. Lovecraft here, to the Victorian, complex ones. Solomon Kane's enemies are a pretty interesting distinction and example here. These new monsters would also have the same fate as the monsters of old, but human fascination with them never ended. As video games grew in popularity and became more complex, the possibility of becoming the monster was now real. You could play and be a vampire hunter, or you could be the vampire yourself. The possibilities were amazing, yet somehow, in a strange way, limiting. At some point, certain monsters that ended up being playable became staples. And this is the object of our video. Orcs. Yes, one of those staples is the orc. Now, the origins of the orc can be traced back to the genius of J.R.R. Tolkien. But where did he get the word from? Where did he get the idea from? Now, some presume it's from the poem Beowulf, where the name Orcness is made to describe an evil tribe, and somehow related to the Norman invasion of England. But that's kind of false, because Tolkien himself would answer the question about the origins of the name in letter 144 addressed to Naomi Mitchinson. Orcs, the word is, as far as I'm concerned, actually derived from Old English orc, demon, but only because of its phonetic stability, are nowhere clearly stated to be of any particular origin. But since they are servants of the Dark Power and later of Sauron, neither of whom could or would produce living things, they must be corruptions. They are not based on direct experience of mine. But I suppose a good deal to the goblin tradition. Goblin is used as a translation in The Hobbit, where orc only occurs once, I think. Especially as it appears in George MacDonald, except for the soft feet, which I never believed in. The name has the form orc in Sindarin and uruk in Black Speech. Now, it's quite interesting to look through the letters sent by Tolkien. This man is a genius. He created a language and a mythology for England. Anyway, let's go back to our orcs. The next time orcs would appear in something major, well, for us, would be in 1974's Dungeons and Dragons white box set, where they would be exactly like Tolkien's orcs, but their design would be a little different. Rather than being a little more monstrous, taller men, they would be men with pig heads. Not against that, to be honest. Games Workshop would also make their own orcs just as brutal and as warlike as Tolkien's ones. Orcs were a cool warlike race, and people had no problem depicting them like that. Now, Shadowrun, a science fantasy tabletop role-playing game set in an alternate future in which cybernetics, magic, and fantasy creatures coexist, well, they would have something else to say. They would also have their own brand of orcs that they introduced in 1989, and these orcs would be monsters with human struggles. Don't trust me? Here's how they were written. He is coarse and rough and of limited sensibilities, but he does function in society. He's not a psychotic killer as some humanist cultists claim. He's just making a living doing what he does best. The description is for an orc mercenary. Orcs would then be portrayed in video games, but they would pretty much follow the same warlike tribal concept. Which really shows how good orcs are as a race when you need a race to fill a certain position. Now, it's quite a task to be so good at something that narrative-wise, you are always a must-pick. On the reverse part of this weird coin would be the humans, because they were good at almost anything, but not really that perfect. You can still use an elf or a dwarf or hobbit, bobbit, whatever, in certain aspects. But the idea is that since we can relate to humans better than to orcs, humans can be used in more diverse and interesting scenarios. And this puts the two races into either a jack of all trades, like the human, or a master of one, like the orc's position. Which really brings in something interesting to the table when discussing orcs and how they evolved along the years. But you know what, we'll get to that point soon. Let's look at one interesting interpretation that comes from the Elder Scrolls arena. Now, they would use orcs for, of course, their intended purpose, and they will write this: orcs are a larger version of goblins. Indeed, scholars have often speculated that these two creatures are somehow related. Nevertheless, they are stronger than their cousins, and very dangerous, often equipping themselves with weapons found on their opponents. They are not overly intelligent, but are cunning enough to stalk their prey and set up ambushes. This presents us that the orcs have some intelligence there. They're not the low intelligence variety that we've seen since Tolkien. But let's move to the next game in the Elder Scrolls series, Daggerfall, because this one will also add a few more words for us. From a distance, an orc may resemble a large, squat, muscular man, before the tusks became evident and the green skin and the piggish eyes are seen. Usually, when the viewer is that close to an orc, he or she is not taking notes about the details. Orcs are among the most common encounters around Liliac Bay, particularly around the southern half of the Rongartian Mountains. They are a constantly savage group, ready for a fight no matter the odds. Some rather eccentric researchers have suggested that the orcs have a culture as ancient and as sophisticated as ours, and that their seeming mindless barbarity is somehow related to rites of passage or tests of courage. It is highly likely that these researchers have never felt the sting of an orc captain's barbed axe. Another interesting thing, we're breaking a little bit the mold with what orcs really are at this point in the Elder Scrolls series, but it wouldn't be the proper knockout until later on. And there's some pretty interesting comparison to take from what's gonna happen next. But let's continue the story. Let's put the description from the Elder Scrolls on pause and look at some of those offered by another big fantasy game that had orcs in it. And compared to the Elder Scrolls series, you could play these orcs. Warcraft. In the first Warcraft game, we get short stories that tell us about each side. In Warcraft I, for the orcs, we have this story by Garona. The orc side shows us that orcs are of low intelligence, brutal and warlike.
The destiny of the orcish hordes. The history and legends concerning the invasion and domination of the human lands scribed by Garona of the Shadow Council. The stories of battle and victory have always been told, and in the past it was up to the leaders of each assault to document the past. While fine leaders in war, these chieftains lacked the ability to convey those actions with written words. I present as an example. Thought go through shiny hole, then me fall down but me good. Me find many good things to eat. We find village, we mash them and eat their food. Thought stop now, head hurt from right. The fact that I am of both orc and human lineage, combined with the skills and schooling I have acquired from my journeys, has elevated me to the position I now hold. As chief interpreter to the Shadow Council, the duty of preserving the accounts of our conquering of this world and the eventual crusade into the land of humanity has fallen now upon my shoulders. I, Garona, now humbly present that history Our destiny concerning the domination over these lands has been foretold by the clan mystics for hundreds of years. Having risen from the mire of swamps and marshes, the Orcish hordes have swept across this domain in the fulfillment of that destiny. Many ages passed as our influence slowly spread, causing pain and darkness to follow in our wake. Be they in lush plains hidden in thick forests or at the rocky crags overlooking the seaside, our armies rolled over what pathetic resistance our enemies could muster. Their crops died on the stalk and their fields lay fallow, for we left none alive to tend them. Using the arcane powers of our warlocks and necromancers, not even the mightiest of our foes could long stand against our increasing onslaught. One by one our enemies fell, and we became stronger with each victory. In time, by subjugating all who would oppose our rise to power and enslaving these weaker races to use as we pleased, we conquered both nature and creatures to finally rise to the pinnacle of this world. Still, we craved more, and decades of constant bickering between clans served to divide our race amongst itself. Soon factions arose, each seeking to control the Orcish domain for themselves. These petty arguments turned to armed conflict and then to war as the need for conquest burned hot in Outsic blood. If no lands existed that were ruled by enemies, then we would take the lands of our brethren. The only clan to ignore these plays for power were the warlocks. Secluded in their towers, they saw the danger that was present. Although it pleased the necromancers that these battles fed the earth and underworld with rivers of blood, the warlocks feared that no orc would be left alive. This would serve to upset the delicate balance that allowed them to control the powers that they held in check and called upon to work their magics. If this balance were to be maintained, the Orcish hordes would need to be supplied with new battles against a common foe. It was during a period of research that the small tear in the dimensional fabric was noticed. Many years passed as the warlocks sought to unlock the mysteries of this tiny rift. The undertaking of numerous trials and tests led to the conclusion that this phenomenon could serve as a portal to another dominion if it could be controlled. The Orcish warlocks began experimentation towards focusing the rift, gradually making it larger and more stable. Eventually, they were able to create a small portal, just large enough for one of their clan to pass through. The stories that this subject returned with almost convinced his colleagues that the experience had left him insane, but the strange, unknown plants he held served as sure evidence of his claims. This allowed the sect to approach the strongest leaders of the splintered orc clans and request that they cease their war for 1 year. At the end of that time, they promised the chance to accomplish the taking of a new world. Controlling the rift proved to be easier as it grew larger, and within the passing of 3 moons it stood ready to send a small detachment of troops to this new world. A blue circle of energy, roughly 2 1/2 orcs in width, was the sight that greeted the Orcish clan chiefs. Streaks of black and red raced across it as it crackled with otherworldly fires. 7 warriors were to enter the portal and return with a report, detailing the type of lands and creatures that were to be found on the other side. As the warlocks began their incantations to access the power of the rift, a howl began, low at first, then rising in pitch like a dark wolf baying during the blood moon. When the sound grew near to deafening, the warriors were motioned into the circle, now alive with 1,000 colors intertwined and clashing in some cosmic dance. What awaited these 7 was beyond even their wildest imagining. The sack of the village was a simple matter, hardly worth the telling. Yet hundreds of times the tale was recounted, and 100 more would be expected and relished. A group of strange, sharp-edged buildings was the first sign of any true opposition they encountered. A rough dirt path led into a trio of farms. The gray of dawn was lightening as the sun of this world rose over the hilltops. It was a bright yellow orb that shone twice as brightly as our own, and made the days exceedingly hot. Then out of the odd little hut came what must have been a member of this land's true race. Small, pink, and spare of muscle were these creatures. The warriors grinned wickedly at each other, knowing that if this represented the breed of stock they would need to pen in order to take this world, victory was but a matter of moments. Rushing out of their hiding place, they swarmed upon the village and slew every living thing they could find. The males offered some small resistance, but the females and children were like taking grok to the slaughter. Their homes held few values, but their fields were full of a tasty grain. Their livestock, as little as there was, also proved excellent, and what they could not eat or pack was set to the torch. The trinkets brought back from this place were of a craftsmanship unknown to the orcs, and were quickly taken by the leaders of the clans for their own treasure hoards. This new world, heavy with vast expanses and soft, weak protectors, would prove a rich jewel to add the crown of the orcs. Our order of ascension is a simple one. Only the strongest survive. All matters of politics or dispute are settled in open debate. This can lead to hostilities in many cases, but it is the fastest and simplest way to come to a conclusion on most matters. Each orc has the right to make heard his arguments, as long as he can back them up with fact or steel. To gain the upper hand is a sign of strength, and strength is counted highly among the hordes. A decisive victory in battle raises the commander and his warriors to a place of honor and control. This hold is tenuous, however, for the higher one climbs, the farther and more deadly the fall. By this time we had learned much of this new domain and those who dwelled here. While difficult to understand in many ways, they proved similar enough to us in many ways. A sharp blow to the head resulted in death. Lack of food led to starvation. Pain also affected them in the same way it had all of our enemies and proved to be an effective means of extracting information. To learn that the name of this place was Azeroth and the inhabitants here were called humans was among the first bits of information we gathered. We began the taking of Azeroth by moving out cautiously and learning what we could, but all too soon rash judgment prevailed as the taste of greed tainted the palates of the Orcish clan chiefs. After many arguments ensued, it was decreed that an assault upon the tall castle in the north would serve to crush our enemies and place the orcs upon the throne of power. More and more warriors were brought through the rift, and with them seemed to come the essence of our world. The warlocks claimed it was some effect of the portal, but the lands about our entryway soon became as desolate as those of our home. Entry into the castle was a simple matter, for the prosperity that had made this land so attractive to us had also bred weakness in the humans. Their guards were unprepared as our forces poured through the gates and over the walls of their stronghold. Their males did well to stop us for as long as they did, but our numbers and strength soon tilted the battle in our favor. Victory would have been assured, but for the arrival of their great mounted soldiers. These fiends rode atop beasts of muscle and sinew that crashed through our ranks and dealt as much damage to our troops as did their riders. These knights, as we have come to know them, rallied what few soldiers remained and began driving us out of the castle. Our every turn was countered, as we were forced to retreat towards the gateway back to our world. Some trick of magic had them always at our back, sides, and in our path. We barely reached the edges of the swamplands that now surrounded the portal and eluded our pursuers in its murky depths. It has been some 15 years since this costly decision altered the course of our destiny. Many called for the closing of the gate, while other factions fought for another attack upon the humans with all of our forces. Out of this chaos arose a single orc with a cunning and guile that few others possessed. Careful manipulations and the use of what support he could muster made his voice ever stronger as time passed. After key opponents were dealt with, few could offer any opposition to his plans, and the rule of the great orc war chief Blackhand was upon our people. His cruelty and dominance in battle is only overshadowed by his lust for power. He has studied the means with which human armies are able to defeat overpowering numbers of orcs through strategy and guile. From these tactics he has learned to bring organization to the scattered attacks of our raiding parties. He sought assistance from both houses of the arcane arts, searching for other weapons to add to his arsenal. The culmination of these plans will involve the uniting of all the orcish clans, armies, warlocks, and necromancers alike, to bring about the eventual destruction of the human race. The Age of Chaos is now at hand. At Garona of the Shadow Council.
That was nice. It's nice to have good Warcraft lore. Anyway, we also learn now, thanks to this, that there is a group of orcs that can write, are coherent, and devious. Warcraft, much in the same way as the Elder Scrolls, would start to break the usual mold that orcs came in. Warcraft II's Orc story, would work even more to do this.
Like an elemental force of havoc and destruction, we thundered through the lands of the Draenor, devastating all that we beheld. Not one life was spared. No building was left standing. The only traces of their existence were the blood-soaked fields they had worked for nearly 5,000 years, and the rank acrid smell of the huge victory fires that consumed the bodies of their young. The Draenor were a weak people, hardly worth the effort of our raiding sweep. In the end, however, even these simple victories served to keep the inferior in their place. It has always been so with my kind. The savage, brutal tendencies of the masses are easily manipulated by those who hold true power. Power is the true force that drives the great destructive machine that is the Horde. Those who imagine themselves in possession of this power rally around their clan banners of violence. Yet without a common foe, even the leaders of the Orc clans blindly turn upon each other. The appetite for destruction that prevails amongst these fools drives the Horde. Might and might alone is honored above all things. I am Gul'dan, the greatest of all warlocks and initiate of the seventh circle of the Shadow Council. No one knows the dark, burning allure of ultimate power better than I. In what passed as my youth, I studied orc magics through the tribal shaman of my clan. My natural talent for channeling the cold, negative energies of the twisting nether brought me notable standing amongst the other shaman, and I knew that even Ner'zhul, the greatest of my teachers, became jealous of me as my abilities grew ever stronger. My aspirations rose higher than those of my peers and masters alike, for I knew that the scope of their vision was limited by their devotion to the advancement of the Horde. I cared nothing for the Horde or its petty politics. I cared nothing for this world over which we had complete dominion. I cared only for the chance to fathom the spiraling mysteries of the great dark beyond. I had begun secret explorations of energies far beyond the scope of anything that my so-called tutors could possibly comprehend. It was at this time that I discovered a being of immense power, the demon Kil'jaeden. I was in awe of his heartless fury. To witness his awesome power was to be all but consumed in the fleeting, fevered nightmares he brought me. I touched the essence of that which lies beyond. Within me an unfathomable lust was sown, a desire to wield the fury of ethereal storms and to stand unscathed within the dying hearts of burning suns. Under the tutelage of Kil'jaeden, I realized how limited even my understanding had been. Untold histories of ancient demon races and primal magical dimensions were made known to me. I learned that there existed worlds without number, scattered throughout the darkness beyond the sky. Worlds to which I might lead the Horde as only one of my abilities could. Though I remained with my people on the dark red world of the Draenor, I soon learned to project myself into the depths of the twisting nether, being driven nearly mad by the whispering chaos contained therein. Although it seemed it would mean my death, I was irresistibly compelled to continue my sojourn until, finally unbound from my corporeal existence, I understood the whispers. It was then that I first spoke to the dead. Ancestral worship has long been at the heart of Orcish religion. While nearly all of the Orcish hordes believed that our dead elders watched and guided us from the depths of some lost realm of chaos, I believe this notion to be a product of ritual and not reality. Within the twisting nether I discovered that the spirits of the dead do linger on. floating on the astral winds between the worlds. I learned that they kept their endless silent vigil over the clans in hope of finding some means of escape from their lifeless torment. I knew then that these spirits of the dead would be a useful tool for anyone who could bind them to his will. Years passed. My apprenticeship under Kil'jaeden had allowed me to become the most powerful warlock the clans had seen in many generations. My place within the Horde was as a respected leader, but as ever tensions ran high amongst the clans. The destruction of the Draenor left nothing upon which the great beast of war could feed. After centuries of violence and warfare, we had finally conquered the whole of our world. With no enemies left to crush and no new lands to conquer, the clans had fallen into a state of utter anarchy. Minor disputes between clans led to open battle and massive bloodshed. Those chieftains who attempted to assume the position of overlord soon found themselves slaughtered by the ravenous legions of the disheartened Horde. I knew that the time had come to claim the mantle of power that I had so long neglected. I quickly gathered together the few warlocks who had shown some spark of passion and desire to rise above the petty quarreling of the clans. To these warlocks I bestowed the knowledge of the dead by leading them in secret rituals and communing with the spirits of the twisting nether. Those who were incapable of channeling this power were destroyed. After a time, a pact was forged between the members of our circle and the dark spirits whose energies we had learned to invoke. I would use my place among the warlocks to shape the thoughts of others while, cloaked by a veil of secrecy, they would be immune to the caprices of the bloodthirsty masses. Thus did the Shadow Council come to be. Within a few short months, the Shadow Council had its hand in all of the important political matters within the Horde. Nothing occurred within the Horde that we did not know about, and many events took place by our design, so cleverly implemented that even the clan chieftains were oblivious to our manipulations. Before half a year had passed, we had assumed near total control of the inner workings of the Horde. Yet behind all of our secret machinations, there loomed the silent and ominous shadow of the demon Kil'jaeden. In pursuit of furthering our magical resources, I opened a new school of magical discipline that became known as necromancy. We began training young warlocks in the arcane mysteries of life and death. Again, with tutelage from the demon Kil'jaeden, these necrolites delved into the dark arts, eventually gaining power enough to animate and control the bodies of the newly dead. Every victory, every success left me with an emptiness I could not fill. I came to realize that the Shadow Council could serve my purposes only to an extent, and thus I would require even greater power should I wish to become the true harbinger of our destiny. Things were well within the Horde. Though the Shadow Council kept the warring clans pacified by the promise of escape from the dying world, I knew that this new order, much like the war against the Draenor, would provide only a brief respite if I could not find new lands for the Orcs to conquer. My contemplation on this matter was disturbed late one night when I was surprised by the sound of screams emanating from the Warlock's tower. I arrived to find many of the apprentices locked in deep trances, their faces twisted into masks of pain. The warlocks, whom I questioned in detail, could tell me only that they had felt an unexplainable presence in their dreams. I returned to my stronghold, deeply puzzled by the fact that whatever it was that had contacted the warlocks had made no attempt to reach me. I sought the counsel of Kil'jaeden about this presence. He also was touched by this power, a power that was beyond any he had ever experienced before. Whether it was the image of a force so awesome that it could cause this baneful demon to actually feel fear, or my own trepidation, I fled, moving aimlessly through the twisting nether for what seemed an eternity. T was during my fevered flight that the presence finally made contact with me. It radiated untold power, but it lacked the emotionless control displayed by Kil'jaeden. My senses seemed to take control over the dread that had engulfed me, and my mind began to cipher and reason. I knew that if I could divine the desires of this force, no matter how powerful, I could use it to further my own ends. The presence identified itself as Medivh, a sorcerer from some far and distant world. We communicated not in words but in a guarded joining of minds. His mind seemed boundless, but his thoughts moved so swiftly that it was difficult to learn anything from him. All the while I knew that he was probing me, learning more and more about the orcs and our magic. I could never learn as much from him as he would from me, and I soon broke contact with him. I sought the counsel of Kil'jaeden, but he refused to answer my summons. Somehow I knew that he had forsaken his students because he was afraid of this Medivh. I found myself again doubting my skills. Could I contend with a being who could intimidate my own master? I continued to venture into the twisting nether for several weeks, all but forgetting the disturbance that had caused me to question myself. Then one night Medivh appeared to me in my dreams. "You fear me, for you do not understand me. See my world and understand your fear, then fear no more." I was powerless to resist what came next. Barren wastes, dark swamps teeming with life, endless fields of emerald grasses, forests of magnificent trees, farmlands filled with rich harvests, villages of proud, strong people. Images came flashing much too quick to comprehend. And then something. A fleeting picture that left a longing stirring inside of my soul, buried deep beneath the ocean. Dark and ruined, but still breathing. Still pulsing with the lifeblood of the earth itself. An ancient power. Ancient and terrible. I awoke. I embraced consciousness, knowing all along that the dream had been real. Medivh had shown me the wonders of his world, knowing that the Horde would not be content until his world was ours. I met with the members of the Shadow Council concerning the visions that we had seen. Although there was much debate as to the true intentions of this Medivh, I informed the Shadow Council that a way to escape from our world would soon be ours. I would seek the aid of Medivh in creating a way to get to his world, and then we would subjugate his race as we had done to all others who stood before us. Although he had appeared to many warlocks with these images of a new and fertile world, we agreed to keep the knowledge of this enigmatic message to ourselves. Those warlocks outside of the Shadow Council who had shared in the visions were killed. For if the secret were revealed before preparations were made, the Horde would tear itself apart. Weeks passed with no word from Medivh. My attempts to contact him were fruitless. It was as if he had erased any trace of himself from the twisting nether. Some members of the council gave up any hope of the wizard ever returning. Then the rift appeared. It took considerable time to expand the rift enough to send the massive frame and orc through. The first scouts to return from the other side seemed to be driven completely mad by what they had seen. These early failures did not deter us, and subsequent quests confirmed that the world beyond this rift appeared similar to what was depicted in our visions. With the combined powers of the Horde's warlock clans and the Shadow Council, we were able to enlarge the mysterious rift so as to create a portal. This portal was used to move a great number of orcs into this unknown land. A small outpost was quickly built on the other side of the rift, and orc scouts were sent to explore the surrounding areas. The agents of the Shadow Council reported that the denizens of this world were called humans, and their lands were known as Azeroth. We found that these humans were a weak race, farming their fields and living peacefully in the countryside. I feared that they would prove no more of a challenge than the Draenor, and would not appease the hunger of the Orcish war machine for long. The clan chieftains, quickly swayed by their lust for blood and war, agreed that it was time to leave this dying world and lay claim to the domains of Azeroth. While the Shadow Council kept close watch over the workings of the Horde, the masses looked to the clan chiefs as their leaders. Two chieftains arose who were well respected and feared by the various clans: Cho'Gall, the Ogre Mage of the Twilight's Hammer clan, and Kilrog Deadeye of the Bleeding Hollow clan. These powerful leaders were expected to direct the Horde to a swift and savage victory over the humans. Thus, as the Horde gradually channeled through the rift into Azeroth, Cho'Gall and Kilrog began to plan their assault against the human stronghold of Stormwind. The attack against Stormwind was catastrophic. Our armies, expecting to meet weak resistance, charged headlong into the enemy fortress. Surprisingly, the human soldiers held our forces at bay. Then they unleashed warriors mounted upon beasts of muscle and sinew to devastate our troops. The humans forced our troops to retreat back into the swamplands surrounding our outpost and the portal where, only by the invoking the shrouding mists of shadow were we able to escape. This decisive and humiliating defeat threw the Horde into chaos. Cho'Gall and Kilrog blamed each other's incompetence for the failure, and the Orcs quickly polarized into factions that supported either chieftain. The Shadow Council desperately sought a remedy to the violence that was sure to follow, but the volatile nature of the Orcs made it difficult to appeal to reason or wisdom. I realized that the Horde needed a strong leader that could unify the clans under his control and be kept in his place. Thus did I first learn of Blackhand the Destroyer. Blackhand, chieftain of the young Blackrock clan and a raider in the Sethagor Arm, was well honored by most Orcs within the Horde. More importantly, he was extremely lustful, and this made him easily corruptible. With help from the Shadow Council, I set the eager Blackhand upon the horned throne of the War Chief. To his credit, Blackhand was a ruthless dictator who inspired awe and terror from his warriors. While the Horde rallied under Blackhand and the other chieftains acquiesced control to him, it was I who dictated policy by blackmailing and bribing Blackhand. With Blackhand's ascension to War Chief, order was restored to the Horde. I was visited again by the visage of Mediv, who appeared more in control of his powers but less in control of his mind. Petitioning the Horde to destroy the kingdom of Azeroth but to make him ruler of its people, Mediv offered all manners of treasures and baubles to me. I assured him that his world was ours for the taking, and that he held nothing that could persuade the Horde to do his bidding. His face broke into a wicked sneer as he proceeded to show me the image of an ancient tomb, upon which was etched the name of the Demon Lord Sargeras. The tomb of Sargeras, the demon lord who had instructed my own tutor Kil'jaeden, was entombed upon this pathetic little world. Destiny had chosen to lay the hand upon my shoulders alone, for Kil'jaeden had told me that the lost tomb contained power absolute, enough to make any who could control it into a living god. Mediv pledged that he would grant me the location of the tomb if only I would use the Horde to destroy his enemies. Thus, the Orcish hordes made war against the kingdom of Azeroth. We took the lands of Azeroth from the humans and razed all that we surveyed. My personal assassin, Garona the Half-Orc, executed Azeroth's leader King Lane and returned his heart to me. Although the Horde dominated Azeroth and the pathetic worms who defended it, my own plans were badly hampered. A small band of human warriors stormed Medivh's tower and engaged the insane sorcerer in direct combat. As his body was slashed and torn by the swords of Azeroth, Mediv began to transmit telepathic waves of trauma across the astral plane, which easily shattered even my formidable defenses. I attempted to reach into the sorcerer's mind and steal the location of the tomb from him directly, but before I could divest the location, Medivh was killed by the Azerothians. Having been inside his mind at the moment of his temporal death, I suffered a massive psychic backlash and fell into a catatonic state. For weeks I slept, as if dead, closely guarded by my faithful warlocks. When I finally arose, I learned of the shift in the balance power within the Horde. Blackhand had been killed. Without my magics and counseling to aid him, Blackhand fell prey to a surprise attack launched by one of his strongest and most trusted generals, Orgrim Doomhammer. Orgrim was quick to consolidate his power within the Horde, justifying the assassination of Blackhand by securing false testimony that supported his claims of the Destroyer's incompetence as war chief. It seemed that the hand of fate had struck me a harsh blow. Orgrim set out to uncover the inner workings of the Horde, leaving no stone unturned. Eventually his spies captured my servant Garona, and under intensive, agonizing torture, forced her to reveal the existence and location of the Shadow Council. She was weaker than I had expected. Suspecting that the Shadow Council was a threat to his control of the Horde, Doomhammer led his Wolf Riders in a surprise attack against my citadel near the ruins of Stormwind Keep. The Warlocks, caught unprepared by Orgrim's assault, held off the Horde as long as their magics would last. Having no time to rest or replenish their energies, the Warlocks fell before the wrath of Orgrim. In the end, the Doomhammer was victorious. Any surviving Warlocks were branded as traitors to the Horde. The public executions were effective in weakening my position and strengthening his. I was taken before Orgrim and questioned at length about my involvement with the Shadow Council. Being greatly weakened by the backlash of Medivh's death as well as the energies I had expended during the battle, I found that I was in no position to either threaten nor harm the war chief. Orgrim made it clear to me that the Horde was under his control, and that he was not as easily swayed as his predecessor. The gleam in his eye and the steel at his side bespoke his intentions, but I would not be defeated so easily. While he may have held the upper hand, I reminded him that with the death of the Warlocks, I was the last true sorcerer within the Horde. Orgrim, made impudent by his victory, agreed that perhaps I could prove useful, and agreed to let me live by his good graces. I silently vowed that he would one day take those words to his grave. Although his suspicions of me were never fully assuaged, I did succeed in convincing the war chief that the raiders were preparing to unite with the Sons of Blackhand in a revolt against him. Although this claim was untrue, Orgrim was already suspicious of Rend and Maim and so disbanded the multitude of Wolf Riders, sending them into the various arms of the Grunt forces. To demonstrate my loyalty to Orgrim and the Horde, I promised to create a host of undead riders that would be completely loyal to him alone. Although the Doomhammer did not fully trust me, the idea was sufficiently appealing, and so I was allowed to enter seclusion to create this new legion. Even with the aid of my necrolytes, I was unsuccessful in bringing forth this undead force. Failure and weakness were all that these minions could offer me, until I sensed that while their spirits were willing, it was the flesh that was weak. I summoned them to a great altar constructed of ironwood and black root, where, at the height of a black incantation, I took the lives of every last one of them. In the bloody wake of their executions, the necrolytes would then at last nourish my creation of the ultimate undead servant. Using what few resources I still controlled within the Horde, I acquired many of the long-dead corpses of the fallen knights of Azeroth. Into these twisted and decayed forms I instilled the essences of the greater members of the Shadow Council, who were quite willing to return to the mortal plane to wreak terror and havoc once again. I furnished each of the Dark Riders a jeweled truncheon through which they could better focus the unearthly powers they would brandish. Into these jewels were infused the raw necromantic magics of the freshly slain necrolytes. Thus were the Death Knights born. Orgrim Doomhammer was pleased with these Knights of Death. Although the spirits of the Shadow Council remained loyal to me, they feigned allegiance to the War Chief. Orgrim was well satisfied with the realization of my promise, and allowed me to go about my own affairs. I will be patient and bide my time, pretending to be the faithful servant until the time comes to show this presumptuous, boisterous upstart who is greater between us. My designs to discover the tomb of Sargeras still remain. I have assembled the Storm Reaver clan to be my support when the season finally comes to strike back at Orgrim for his insolent crimes against me. That day draws near, and Doomhammer cannot know what terrors await him. For I am Gul'dan, I am darkness incarnate, I will not be denied.
By that point, Warcraft II, much in the same way as the Elder Scrolls series Daggerfall, would try to break the mold, and they're really close to changing how orcs operate as a species when it comes to media. And boy, this wouldn't be the end of it. 2002 would be an interesting year for all orc kind, because the changes made by Warcraft and the Elder Scrolls would hit hard. First, it would be in the newest installment of the Elder Scrolls series, Morrowind, that would change how orcs are viewed. This would also be the first time orcs would be playable in an Elder Scrolls game. And I quote, "These sophisticated barbarian beast people in the Hrothgarian and Dragontail mountains are noted for their unshakable courage in war and their unflinching endurance of hardships. Orc warriors in heavy armor are among the finest frontline troops in the Empire. Most Imperial citizens regard Orc society as rough and cruel, but there is so much to admire in their fierce tribal loyalties and generous equality of rank and respect among sexes." But the Elder Scrolls wouldn't be the only ones to change up orcs. It's 2002, and that means an impressive RTS game would launch, and it would be a sequel to a sequel. That would be Warcraft III. And boy oh boy, now the orcs are the noble savage trope. The orcs have been pretty much changed completely in Warcraft 3 compared to Warcraft 2 and Warcraft 1. The orcs are no longer bloodthirsty savages, but they are now more elevated warriors led by Thrall, their Moses-like figure, if you will. The orcs are now presented with more honor, more nobility. They're no longer the conquerors they used to be, and they've just got a bunch of humanity dropped on top of them. If you wonder how this changed, and how was it possible to go from one end to the other, well, there's a book called Lord of the Clans, and also a custom campaign for Warcraft 3 with the same name, and those two pretty much explain this drastic change that the orcs have. Now, I must also bring up the funny coincidence of both the Elder Scrolls and the Warcraft series breaking the norm with orcs in their second installments, and the third one being the most important that changed how orcs operate. It's also funny that the third installment for both games came out in 2002. Even more funny is the fact that The Elder Scrolls launched in May, and Warcraft III launched in July, and such a short distance away, both games came out and changed the modus operandi when it comes to orcs. For better or for worse, both the Elder Scrolls series and Warcraft would hang on to these depictions of orcs. But Warcraft would, in a strange way, try to neuter everything related to the old orc lore. So much so that you could name the race something else and it wouldn't really matter that much anymore. They were called orcs once, but the same lore that made them interesting in the first place, Warcraft I and II, doesn't really work in World of Warcraft. It used to be cool the change of scenery, of characters, of everything in Warcraft III, but they seem to have distanced themselves from even those interesting bits and went into parts of orc lore that don't really make that much sense compared to the rest. Gone are the aspects that made orcs interesting. Gone are the aspects that really got people into playing the Horde. And instead we are left with an Alliance Light. Orcs did fall off with Warcraft. But whatever, we're not here to judge Warcraft. Just know that for a time, orcs did their job very good and very well to both their old, evil side and to this new noble savage trope. Now let's move on from here to our good pals at Games Workshop and their Warhammer games. When it comes to Warhammer, orcs evolved in a pretty interesting way. In 40k, they kept the same savagery for which orcs are known, and they gave them a Cockney accent. Also made them work in a little strange way. Now, 40k orcs, and that's orcs with a K, sound like football hooligans. Which, if you know orcs, it just works. On the fantasy side, orcs remained pretty consistent in their traits and how they acted. They were more serious compared to their London cousins, but they still worked pretty well. And then there's the Blood Bowl orcs. And in Blood Bowl, everybody's a goofball, including the orcs. And I would say the orcs more so than in 40k. If you're wondering about Age of Sigmar, know that Age of Sigmar pretty much has the same style of orcs that Warhammer Fantasy used to. They're just more armored up. Moving from tabletop and video games to card games, Magic the Gathering. MTG showed orcs in their more tribal and warlike interpretation. Though sometimes it deviated from that by either having them be acrobats or guards. At the end of the day, they would still fit their role and they would still feel orky. It's also one of my favorite tribes alongside goblins. Now there'll be another interpretation of orcs that's interesting, and that's of orcs and men. And we have this intro for that.
War. Not exactly a new concept. At first, it was really about the coming of an empire. All the human kingdoms on the Icerian continent united under a single crown and a single religion. And in both cases, I can tell you they weren't just playing around. But the end result was there. The Emperor Damocles made humans his sword. It was when His Majesty decided he wanted to extend his influence to the southern lands that sparks began to fly. Because, well, the peoples of the south are beast-like green creatures 8 feet high, all muscle and nerves, with a natural-born talent for war. So, it figures they resisted. Despite besieging their villages, and even though the Imperial Army was far better organized, The damned orcs fought back with savage rage, and their victories were the kind remembered for ages. But Damocles wasn't just gonna sit there and take it. Protecting their territory behind a giant wall, the Empire would never give up land, and its ruler wasn't planning on standing pat. With the construction of the wall, the scale of the war began to alarm the neighboring provinces. Faced with the Green Peril, the Empire saw the elves and the dwarves as potential allies. With their support, a quick victory over the Greenskins was a certainty, and peace could finally return to the Icerian continent. Afterwards, it just remained to be seen what kind of peace would await the vanquished. Over the decades of conflict, the orcs were already beginning to figure it out. They were much sought after for their strength and toughness, and so grinding slavery was always going to be the result. Submit or die. Needless to say, for a goblin like me, things were going to be just as bad. We were there to be had like rats in a trap. Yeah, it's not easy being a greenskin on this fucking continent. You got my sympathy if that's your case.
Of Orcs and Men takes orcs in an interesting direction, I would say. Orcs are now bigger than humans, but they've mostly been bigger than humans. Except in this one. In this one, they're gigantic. For some reason. Whatever. Also, orcs are no longer the conquerors. They're no longer the warlike tribe that goes around and conquers villages and raids and so on. They are the conquered, which is an interesting perspective flip when it comes to orcs and how they've been portrayed in the media. Overall, I think of Orcs and Men as a pretty mediocre game, to be honest, but its depiction of orcs really brings something new to the table. Unfortunately, it comes with a little bit of a problem. Yeah, nevertheless, that's for another day. What happened to D&D orcs, you might ask? Well, they pretty much remained consistent in their portrayal until ESG money got involved. And that made orcs a target from twatter freaks. And orcs got changed from an evil race to a whatever race. And why did the twatter freaks cry, you might ask yourself? Well, you see, there is a prevailing mental illness in society. One that tells us that orcs represent or are a caricature of black people. In worlds where black people exist. I'm not joking. Looking at an evil, tribal, warmongering race and pointing at black people is hilarious for all the wrong reasons. We was orcs and shit, I guess. Now, there's more to tackle on the subject because it's big. There are papers written about how orcs are black people. But nevertheless, I'll leave you with a few points regarding this. Black people already exist in the setting. That's pretty racist. And shut up and go away. Moronic ideas aside, let's go back to something fun about orcs. Orcs must die. It's a nice RTS game that you can play with people, and orcs are a horde race that you have to destroy using traps and everything available to you. It's quite fun. I've enjoyed them all, and the orcs are portrayed in their more classic look, so that's pretty fun too. In Dungeon Keeper, trolls and orcs might have been reversed because the orcs look very much like trolls, and the trolls look very much like orcs. Overall, we can see how orcs have went through the same evolutionary process as some other monsters, such as werewolves. They started in one way and became a different. They started as just pure evil and became more complex down the road. And while both interpretations are good, in my opinion, the evil variant still works. The evil interpretation is probably one of the best interpretations for orcs out there. Sure, it is okay to have them be compelling characters with human struggles plus their monster struggle. but having a pure evil race just fits something that we as humans can understand as being bad. And we can all agree on war being bad. We can all agree on that. Nevertheless, I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you in the next one.